When you look back at the pivotal moments in pop culture history, do you think back to things like blockbuster movies, Top Gun, The Godfather, absolute pillars of film, just by the way? Is it musicians like Michael Jackson or the Beatles? Two acts that have influenced generations of millions and millions of people. Maybe it's an influential person like Charles Manson or Neil Armstrong. If you haven't heard of either of those people, please read a book. What if I was to tell you that everyone I just mentioned got their start or had a pivotal moment that would change the course of pop culture history forever, all within the same 365 days? This is why I believe 1969 is the most influential year in pop culture history. Coming out of 1968, the world was in a bit of turmoil. People were starting to see that the idealistic peace and love movement of the 60s was starting to lose its shine. People were starting to come to their senses just a little bit and realize that it wasn't all sunshine, lollipops, and or rainbows. 1968 saw the loss of two incredibly influential people. Robert F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. were both assassinated in 1968. They were trying to advance civil rights and de-escalate war tensions, and they were trying to do good things, and they were sadly taken way too soon. Coming into 1969, a lot of countries saw themselves right smack dab in the middle of the Vietnam War. The USA, obviously, alongside people like Australia and New Zealand. But all was not lost. 1969 brought this idea of change and progress moving forward. But I don't think anyone knew just how much would go on in 1969. We begin on January 28th, 1969, the 33rd annual NFL Draft. The third and final time they would have a draft which comprised of the NFL and the AFL, the American Football League. You're probably thinking to yourself, BB, you're a Kiwi. Why do you care about American hand egg? And to that I say, don't be ignorant. Go Patriots. The reason why this particular draft and this particular year was important is because the first draft pick went to the Buffalo Bills. And who else would warrant this pick other than the Heisman winning, yard rushing, running back extraordinaire that would be O.J. Simpson. Orenthal James Simpson, better known as O.J. or The Juice or The Juice is Loose, honestly, take your pick, would rush for over 11,000 yards during his career, making him somewhat of a household name. If someone mentioned the NFL and they were very impressed during the late 60s, early 70s, you can almost guarantee that OJ's name was somewhere in the conversation. During this time, dude won a ridiculous amount of honors and trophies. He made All-American teams. Honestly, you check his Wikipedia page and it's just achievement, 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 achievement. And then other stuff at the bottom of that Wikipedia page. At first, OJ was just a football player, and then he went on to do sportscasting. And then he decided acting was his true calling. He went on to do the Naked Gun series with Leslie Nielsen. Great movies. Can't take anything away from those. Unfortunately, he is nowhere near as famous for his football and TV exploits as he was for his private life. I think you know where this is going. On June 12th, 1994... O.J. Simpson came home after a long, hard day of being rich and famous and belligerently murdered his wife and his wife's friend. Allegedly. Obviously, these charges were thrown out of court, and it all was apparently right in the universe according to America. Honestly, it was dubbed the trial of the century at that point. This man's actions or inactions, depending on what side you're on, have basically cemented him into pop culture history literally forever. And it's not to do with his sports or his TV or his film career. It's to do with what might have happened. Allegedly. He has had parody upon parody upon parody of himself appear on TV. SNL, Family Guy. If you Google O.J. Simpson parodies, there's just pages and pages. He's also inspired true crime series, whether that be TV, film, even a book, one of which he penned himself, and the book was called If I Did It. If I Did It. And that's just the first thing. That is the first reason why 1969 is the most iconic. And we're still in January. Let us turn our attention from the morbid to one of the groups that started it all, the Beatles. Although by January 30th of that year, it was so hard to get them all in the same room together and speak to each other, they had to schedule these times. If you've seen Get Back, which was directed by my fellow countryman Peter Jackson, or Sir Peter Jackson as we say in the national anthem, you'll know that John, Paul, George and Ringo really struggled to get this last bit of the album out. If you've seen Get Back, or if you haven't seen Get Back, definitely go watch it. But aside from that, you'll know that this entire thing culminates with the iconic rooftop performance done by the Beatles, which ends up with tens of thousands of people all over the street. They basically get arrested for playing music on public property, which is not illegal and makes no sense when you really think about it. But after multiple warnings and police constable Ray Dagg, who is the most famous of the arresting officers, telling them that if they don't stop, they're going to get arrested, Paul asked for one more. They played Get Back. He changed some of the lyrics to make it rude towards the police, and then they shuffled off of the roof and into the history books. So, I mean, this is one rooftop performance, and it really shouldn't make as much of an impact as it probably has. But when you think about what this has gone on to do, it's pretty insane. You've got Get Back, which is an entire documentary series over 6 hours long that has documented everything leading up to this performance and finishes with the performance. It's been satirized, if you could call it that, in a mockumentary by members of Monty Python called The Ruttles. And one of the best parts about The Ruttles is that George Harrison absolutely loves Monty Python and was actually in this mockumentary as well. Fantastic times. It's even glorified via imitation by America's favorite TV family, The Simpsons. In Season 5, Episode 1, Homer's Barbershop Quartet, we're right at the end of the episode. They're playing on the rooftop. They do Baby on Board, and then George Harrison yet again turns up and rolls down the window and goes, "It's been done." From this date onwards, no band has been able to do a rooftop performance without someone alluding to the fact that the Beatles had done it. It doesn't matter what band is playing on a roof. From here on out, I guarantee you someone somewhere in the crowd, online, in the ethos, is going to mention the fact that someone already did this at number 3 Savile Row in West End, London on a grey afternoon in 1969. If we jump forward to the 3rd of March 1969, not a huge amount happened in February, not going to lie. We see the inception of a military aviation program that was run through the US Navy. This is to make sure that all of the soldiers were adept in different parts of the armed forces, being that they were smack bang in the middle of the Vietnam War, which we will get to later, but the name of this division of naval officers who flew planes was called Top Gun. Obviously, these dudes in 1969 were the namesake and the idea behind the 1986 movie. Top Gun was the highest grossing movie of 1986. With a budget of $15 million, it amassed $357 million at the box office. Massive hit for Paramount Pictures, obviously, but then you turn your attention back to the Navy, and they received a spike of 500% in recruitment within the following 12 months. There's also parody movies like Hot Shots with Charlie Sheen, and there's rip-off movies like Iron Eagle, but there will only really be one Top Gun. They obviously came back. 2022, they did Top Gun Maverick. I still haven't seen it. Please don't shoot me in the comments. These things happen. But to be completely honest, the fact that Tom Cruise came back and did it all again, in between shooting Mission Impossible 237 and 238, I guess you could say that it sort of lasted the test of time with this particular sect of pop culture, but the fact that it kicked off in 1969 amongst all of this other stuff is pretty mental. If we jump forward just 7 days from the inception of Top Gun, and we stay in the realm of sort of pseudo things that would become movies, we fall upon one of the most fantastic franchises in the making that would change the perception of how the entire world views the Italian mafia. Mario Puzo's book, The Godfather, was released to the public to extreme critical and commercial success. It stayed on New York Times bestseller list for 67 weeks and sold 9 million books during that time. Remember, this is 1969. That is incredible. Some people put Mario Puzo's book as the chief influence when it comes to bringing the Italian mafia to its craze, I guess you could say, with the original movie adaptation of this book being set for release in 1972, just a few short years afterwards. Aptly also titled The Godfather, it was directed by Francis Ford Coppola. He was a relatively unknown director at the time, but you've got people in this movie like Marlon Brando, Al Pacino, James Caan, putting in these huge performances that would eventually kickstart this franchise and make it a pop culture and just a general media giant. With a $6 million budget, most of which went to Marlon Brando, it managed to turn around, and in the box office it made $270 million dollary-doos. It was nominated for 7 Golden Globes, of which it won 6, 11 Academy Awards, of which it won 3, it was nominated for 1 Grammy and won that Grammy. I could sit here for the next 6 weeks, roughly, and list every single piece of media, trivia, art, music, podcasts, whatever you want to call it, that have been influenced by The Godfather in some way or another. I just don't have the time. So the best thing I can do for you is give you my favorite reference. My favorite reference, again, America's favorite TV family, but Fat Tony and his crew quintessentially ripped off from The Godfather or something Godfather adjacent. It's just good times. It's some of this. It's some of this. Okay, so if we jump forwards now to July 16th, it's not just one of the most pivotal moments in pop culture history. It's one of the most pivotal moments in human history altogether. I am, of course, talking about 3 men going where no man had once gone before and setting foot on the moon. I'm talking about Neil Armstrong. I'm talking about Buzz Aldrin. I'm talking about the other guy. These dudes landed on the moon, beamed it back to Earth in a beautiful black and white 140p so that all of the people that were down here that were lucky enough to afford a television could hear the words,
"It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
For a short period of time while the space race was going on, people stopped wanting to be policemen, firemen, doctors, Superman, and they wanted to be astronauts, space people. But not only was it one small step for man, but a giant leap for mankind, it was also a giant leap for conspiracy theorists, because they have their way of ruining literally everything. The running theory for conspiracy theorists everywhere was that famed director Stanley Kubrick on a soundstage in Hollywood filmed the entire thing, basically made a really crap movie out of it, and tried to help America prove to the Russians that they had won the space race. And now every time someone asks Buzz Aldrin, who is still alive and recently got married, to his face if he actually landed on the moon or not, he used to be really nice about it, now he just knocks people out. It's just so much easier than rehashing the question every single time. And then you go to the other end of the spectrum, you've got movies like 2001: A Space Odyssey, Barbarella, Planet of the Apes, that all saw an incredible spike in ticket sales as soon as this happened. Obviously, these movies weren't for a couple of years after. Some of them were a couple of years before, but what you have to understand is movies used to show in cinemas for an incredibly long time. In mainstream media, you've got documentaries, you've got TV series, you've got all of these different things that were influenced by the space race and in some way quote that initial Apollo 11 mission. And then you've got things like kids' movies where the number one space ranger in the world, Buzz Lightyear, takes his name directly from the guy who punches reporters. I challenge you to find me a piece of space media that I can't trace back to Neil Buzz. I really should Google that guy's name, but it's one of those ones where you sort of just, you know the first two, you don't need to know the last one. Arguably some of the darkest days in 1969 came from August 8th to August 10th. The 8th was the night that on 10050 Cielo Drive, Benedict Canyon, Los Angeles, California. 4 members of the Manson family, headed by the one and only crazy guy, Charles Manson, crawled on their bellies up to this house on Cielo Drive and brutally savaged the 4 people within. They were famous director Roman Polanski's heavily pregnant wife, Sharon Tate, her hairdresser friend, Jay Sebring, Wojciech Frykowski, I'm very sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, and Frykowski's then girlfriend, Abigail Folger, who, if you heard this story, is the heiress to the incredible Folger's coffee fortune. I won't go into the gruesome details. There are plenty of podcasts that have over-explained that and YouTube videos that will tell you just how many stab wounds. I'm just not that guy, so I'm just not going to be doing that. But when I tell you it was gruesome, it was gruesome. 2 days later, the same 4 plus a couple more went to the La Bianca residence, where they equally brutally savaged 2 more people, writing messages on the walls in their blood, etc. It's not a great time. I'm not going to lie to you. Honestly, Google it at your own discretion. Podcast it at your own discretion. Don't image search it. That's a mistake I made. Obviously, this has turned into a slew of different things. Like I mentioned about 4 times, there's a ton of podcasts about it. There are countless books, TV series, movies, readaptations. I mean, I must have seen like a CI episode about Charlie Manson at least once a week for like my entire life because my mum is obsessed with the CI channel. But the most notable of these is probably Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, directed by Quentin Tarantino. Tells a bit of a rehash of the story, but overall, I enjoyed the movie. You don't have to believe all of the movie synopsis videos you see on YouTube. It found its way into music. You've got Trent Reznor from Nine Inch Nails, who actually bought and moved into the house, set up a recording studio, which he dubbed Pig Studios. If you know the story, then you know why that's pretty nuts. He recorded some music, and then his, like, I guess you could call him understudy at the time, Marilyn Manson, who took his last name from Charles Manson and created music that was supposed to be shocking and scary to everybody, but really only appealed to 13-year-old boys with black hair and band t-shirts. He recorded some of Portrait of an American Family in that studio with Trent Reznor in order to, like, I don't know, capture essence or something. I don't know. People are just weird. That's not even the weirdest thing that comes of this. Like, there was an opera that was released in 1990 that retold this entire story, and it starred Iggy Pop. Humans have always had a fascination with the morbid, the macabre, the grotesque. I completely get it. You're into what you're into. If that's where you get your fancies, your kicks, whatever you want to call it, all power to you. I don't care. Just don't bring it to reality. Keep your weird stuff over there. So if we jump forwards by just a week from that occurrence, and we travel 4,446 kilometers northeast from where we were on Cielo Drive, and we will find ourselves on the first day of the last and most important push of the peace and love movement of the 60s, otherwise known as Woodstock. What was originally tipped to be 100,000 people coming to this festival ended up being almost 400,000 individuals coming to this small dairy farm in Bethel, New York, which is about 40 miles away from the actual Woodstock. Promoter Michael Lang couldn't find himself a plot in actual Woodstock, and they had town meetings basically saying, you know, you need to leave or we're going to make you leave. Luckily for Michael and the 60s in general, there was a wonderful dairy farmer who lived, like I say, 40 miles-ish away, who offered up his dairy farm, had these lovely rolling meadows, and in one particular area had this sort of meadow that went down into a cone shape and created a perfect natural amphitheater. On the poster it says, Woodstock Music and Arts Festival, 3 days of peace and music. They weren't kidding with this, and upon reflection, when you look at the movie and all of the documentaries that have been sort of made about this, the overall vibe was pretty positive. You had acts like Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Joe Cocker, The Who, Canned Heat, Santana, just to name like a handful of the crazy amount of fantastically talented musicians who turned up to play this tiny little farm festival in the middle of essentially nowhere. The initial number of people that were supposed to turn up quadrupled. 400,000 is a lot of people, so you ended up with overflowing sewage tanks that created incredibly large and smelly mud pits. You ended up with traffic jams that would block most of the highway. People were either going to the festival on foot. Police tried to take horses to break up some of the traffic to get in between cars, and that didn't work very well either. The way Michael Lang sold this, and he is one of the craftiest promoters that has probably ever lived. Dude had a charming smile and a can-do attitude, literally nothing else, and managed to pull off one of the most iconic things to ever happen to the 60s. It was supposed to be this idea that this was going to be a counterculture festival that promoted peace and love and stood together against the Vietnam War, etc. But I don't think anyone was really worried about that. They were more trying to find that one dude who had the acid for $1. The impact on pop culture, which is the reason why we're here, is insane. You've got Jimi Hendrix playing the Star-Spangled Banner. Half the country thought it was absolutely gorgeous and a true testament to patriotism, and the other half of the country thought it was complete nonsense that sounded terrible. Honestly, if you go and have a proper listen to it yourself, you'll understand that it's true artistry that brings out the emotion in guitar. Feel is everything, and Jimi Hendrix had all of the feels. He was in his feels. He was feeling himself. The art and artistic depictions, whether it be photos, paintings, anything along those lines from this particular era, normally has sort of a psychedelic feel to it. Psychedelia doesn't completely belong to Woodstock, but a lot of people attribute that to Woodstock in one form or another. It entered the general lexicon as how to identify a group of people who were teenagers to early 20s in the late 60s, early 70s. You know, the Woodstock generation is how they are described. You got Charles Schultz, who at face value has nothing to do with Woodstock in general, but the canary character that he had reoccurring in his comic books for over 3 years remained unnamed up until just after Woodstock 1969. His name is actually Woodstock, and he was named after Woodstock. In a lot of the 60s and early 70s media, you'll be hard-pressed to find anything that doesn't include some reference to Woodstock. When talking about the 60s, that's probably the first thing that anyone says. It's one of those things that's going to stay in the collective consciousness of people for hundreds of years. And if you think I'm wrong, well, that's just your opinion, man. Alright, so now we're going to smash out some quickfire stuff. These are TV shows and albums that had extreme influence during this year. Things that went on to create tidal waves when it comes to the butterfly effect. Whether you believe it or not, I don't really care. But like, the idea is that these things have either stayed consistently in pop culture or they have altered pop culture in one way or another. The first thing from this quickfire list is Monty Python's Flying Circus debuted on BBC One on October the 5th, and it was met with rave reviews. These 5 dudes were the silliest people you'd ever see on TV. I was personally raised on Monty Python and Monty Python's Flying Circus, so the movies that came out as well, things like The Life of Brian, The Meaning of Life, The Holy Grail, and the like, you know how much they meant to comedy if you've seen any comedian talk about them. If you go onto Netflix, there is a series called Monty Python's All the Best Bits, and they've got people like Eddie Izzard, Jim Carrey, all of these fantastic comedians sitting there and talking about how much Monty Python meant to them. Just that alone will tell you, without these 5 dudes, we would not have the same amount of freedom in comedy that we do today. I absolutely love Monty Python's Flying Circus. 26th of September on ABC saw the debut of The Brady Bunch. Now, as much as this might sound cringe and old-fashioned, because The Brady Bunch was only around for about 4 or 5 years, had about 102 to 105 episodes. They have only done offshoots of that show. They have never remade that show, and it stands the test of time because of this. the same reruns that you will see on Jones TV, on Prime. These are channels that occur mostly in Australia and New Zealand. The reruns that you will see on those channels are the exact same episodes that our parents and grandparents were watching when this came out in the 60s and lasted through till 74. The man who created the series was a man by the name of Sherwood Schwartz, which is a fantastically large mouthful of S's. But the dude read about the fact that 30% of American families have a child from a previous marriage. So originally the series was going to be called Mine and Yours, and it was going to detail the struggles of the blended family in American society, blah, 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 blah. But it ended up being way more commercially successful than he first thought, and although it only lasted 5 seasons, the amount of times these episodes get played over and over and over again on various channels, every 2 hours there is at least one Brady Bunch episode played somewhere in this world. Personally, one of my favorite things to come out of 1969, on November the 10th, on the newly created PBS network, we saw Jim Henson's Sesame Street brought to life for the first time. The show is still going to this day and has influenced at least 3 generations of people when it comes to reading, writing, overall enjoying yourself and being part of the positive movement that is the universe. A fantastically good time when you're a parent or you were a child at some stage, which I'm sure most of you were. So yeah, Sesame Street and its implications are way too numerous to put into any sort of list or set of categories, but I love Sesame Street. On December 12th, the Jackson 5 debut album was released. Diana Ross presents the Jackson 5. This album had Who's Lovin' You and I Want You Back on it. It propelled them to absolute stardom. It made Michael Jackson the absolute icon that he still is today. Fumbling through history for the last 54 years, Michael Jackson still gets mentioned on the daily somewhere. Dude gets played as much as the Beatles do, and he once owned the Beatles catalog of music. I would love to sit here and rattle off every single thing in pop culture that not only the Jackson 5, but just Michael Jackson by himself has influenced since December of 1969, but we ran out of video. So the album was released on Motown. It garnered quite a few sales, which eventually put them back in the studio so they could keep going and keep creating, and just the sky was the limit with the Jackson 5. I really don't know what else to say. Jumping from one end of peace, love, and positivity to the completely opposite side, on December the 1st in the States, they had the first overall draft lottery. So what that meant is 195 birthdays out of the year were scattered at a calendar, and if you were just so lucky to be born on one of those days, you had no choice but to go and sign up to go over to Vietnam and fight in the war that no one wanted to be a part of. The reason why they did this is because there were no volunteers that were wanting to go anymore because the conditions were trash and the war was a little bit silly. So all in all, 2.2 million men out of a possible 27 million ended up being drafted and taken over to Vietnam to fight, basically lay down their lives for a movement that a lot of people didn't believe in. USA Today actually has a website where you can go and chuck in your birthday and it will tell you whether or not you would have been drafted. I personally would have been safe. I would have been fine. I probably would have worn one of those lovely girly bandanas and made artillery in factories like everybody else. Unfortunately, my brother and friend of the channel, Mr. Louis George, would not have been so lucky. Being born on August the 31st, he would have been drafted. Just type F in the chat. I really don't know what else to tell you. Apart from, as part of our condolences here on the BB Malloy channel, you should really go over and subscribe to him because he's got some amazing content coming out real soon. The reason why it hit so hard in America especially is because it wasn't just people that were of military mindsets going. If you got drafted, it was your local paperboy, it was your local milkman, it was your local shopkeeper that were just all of a sudden packing up, shaving their heads, getting dressed in green and buggering off to the other side of the world to fight people they don't know for a country that doesn't respect them anyway. Do not get me wrong, this is not to take away from Vietnam War veterans. I know a couple of them myself. They are very upstanding people. They do not get treated the way they probably should. When they get back from war, there's a lot of PTSD that goes on. These are regular people that were taken out of society and put into a world that have no experience and no business being in. The Selective Service Committee has not changed the way that it does drafts these days. It basically follows a very similar format, but without the selective service part of it, we wouldn't have a lot of the typical things in media that we have now. Obviously, we've got movies like Full Metal Jacket and Forrest Gump, and I know what you're thinking. Forrest Gump wasn't drafted, he volunteered. But without that initial Joe Public general community being added into the Vietnam War, none of this would have meant much to people watching at home or watching in cinemas back in the 90s. So the movies that we got are thanks in part to the Selective Services Committee. The other thing that happens when you have people being added into this realm of war that they're not really used to is that they start writing songs for the common man. Creedence Clearwater Revival had 8 top 10 singles between 69 and 72. They have cemented themselves, John Fogerty especially, into every single Vietnam movie ever created. There is Born on the Bayou, there is Fortunate Son, there is just so much going on. You can hear it coming with the helicopters. And then Fortunate Son starts playing in the background. You get Vietnam flashbacks every time you hear the song. Guys, if you enjoyed this content, please leave a like. Hit the subscribe button if you want more stuff like this. I thought about taking each of these categories and breaking them down, going to a little bit more in depth. If that's something you'd enjoy, let me know in the comments. If you want me to keep doing long form content like this, where I sort of pick a random year and go through how pop culture is influenced by this year, also let me know in the comments. I'm on TikTok, I'm on Instagram, I am not very active on Twitter, and I do not use Facebook at all. So make sure you go over and follow the socials. Let me know that you've come from YouTube, or you've come over from TikTok, or you've come from Instagram, or wherever you might be. But in any case, I've been BB Malloy. You've been amazing. Peace, and have a good day.